Hi, thank you for inviting me to be part of your conference this morning. I'm taping this talk in advance from my home in Baltimore, Maryland, and I'm sorry that I can't be with you there in person. I'm trying to limit my airline flying. In addition to that, we're right now recognizing the 1-year anniversary of the Baltimore uprising, which began after the police murder of a young man named Freddie Gray last year. And so this is just a really important time for me to be home in my city. And so I'm sorry that I'm not there with you. It would actually be much more interesting for me to be speaking to you face to face, but I'm going to give this a go and I hope it is helpful to you. I left practice in 2007 so that I could do advocacy work full time. And I started out in health policy working for a single payer healthcare system at both the state and the national level. I saw up close the depth of the corruption of our political process and how our legislation is really often about what is beneficial for large industries and not interested in looking at the evidence of what might be beneficial for the people. And so it became really clear to me that in these various fights that we're engaged in, we are facing the same obstacles, the domination of our political process by wealth and by large industries and corporations. And that when we work in just kind of isolated silos, like for me working for a single payer healthcare system, not only do we not solve the problem that we're trying to solve, but we also don't have the political muscle to get the kind of reform that we need, reform that actually moves us in a direction towards where we want to go. And so as I, worked on health policy, it became really clear that just getting access to healthcare was not going to improve health outcomes if we didn't also look at other factors like wealth inequality, which is a large driver of poor health outcomes, or access to education, having a safe place to live, having access to healthy food, clean water, clean air, a job with a living wage, being treated with respect. These are all things that have a big impact on our health. And so my work moved more into how do we build political power. And building political power means building popular power, building movements, or what we call a movement of movements, to overcome the influence of these large industries and wealth domination. And so in the climate crisis, we also face a very similar situation. The climate crisis is large. It impacts a lot of areas. It's not just about moving to renewable energies, but it's also about protecting ourselves, and especially those who are most vulnerable, from severe weather. It's about jobs. It's about where people are going to live, dealing with water issues and drought, dealing with food security, transportation, war and conflict. There are a lot of issues that are connected to the climate crisis. And so really important for us not to just operate in our silos, but to recognize that we need to, again, build what's called a movement of movements in order to have that political power. So my work for the last 10 years has really been focused on how we build political power for progressive change. In all of our work that we're doing, whether it's for social, economic, environmental, racial justice, or peace, we're facing a political system that is really broken. And in the United States, we have now, academic data that proves to us what we've known for a long time, which is that we don't have a democracy. We don't have a representative democracy. We have what we call a mirage democracy. It looks like a democracy, but in fact, it's actually a plutocracy, or a political system that benefits, of, by, and for the wealthy. And these academic studies look at policies that have been put in place and see that they overwhelmingly favor the wealthy and not the interests or the needs of the people. And so in that kind of a system, in general, the traditional kinds of advocacy tools that we try to use are not effective. And that's why it's really important for us to look at how we can be more strategic and figure out where to apply pressure and how to apply pressure appropriately to set the agenda and to get the changes that we need. I think of it in this way that we're often told what is on the table, and that table has been set by a system that's corrupted, and so what's on that table is not going to be adequate. And so we as people need to work together to decide what should be on that table and then work to get it put there. In terms of how we decide what we're going to put on that political table, we need to have a framework that we can work within. And so the framework begins by identifying the vision of what kind of changes we would like to see. And then that vision will drive the strategy, and then our strategy will determine the tactics that we use. Now, it's very often common for activists to want to jump right to the tactics, because that's the fun part, right? That's where you get to decide what you're going to do. But if those tactics are not serving a strategy that's serving a vision, then we're not going to go in the direction that we need to go. So in terms of starting out with a vision, we like to think of some sorts of principles that are guiding that vision, and what kind of world do we want to see. And for us, it's one very much that respects human rights. And so there are 5 human rights principles that we use. The first one is universality. Universality means that everybody should have access to whatever it is that we are creating. If it's clean air, if it's healthy food, if it's clean water, everybody needs to have access. The second is equity, and that means that different people or different populations will need different things so that they can have that same access. Another important principle is participation, that people are provided with an avenue to participate in making decisions about things that are going to impact them. And the last 2 are transparency and accountability. So this is part of our vision, and what we're trying to do is, in our organizing, make sure that we are organizing in a way that models the kind of change that we want to see. So when it comes to thinking about energy, one part of dealing with the climate crisis, some of the topics that we need to consider are energy equity, energy democracy, and a just transition. So energy equity means that, as we know, there are affluent parts of the world, and much of the United States is affluent relative to the rest of the world. And so we have access to quite a lot of energy. And so for those who have that excess amount of energy, and we waste quite a bit of it, we need to be thinking about ways that we can reduce our energy usage or cut down on our carbon footprint. For other areas in the United States and around the world, people don't have access to sufficient energy, sometimes to even meet their basic needs, much less be able to participate in the economy. So those areas are going to need to be provided with access to greater amounts of energy. So this is energy equity and kind of balancing our energy use around the world. Energy democracy is also another important concept, because right now we have a lot of big energy. We have big oil, big gas, big nuclear. We're even starting to see big solar and big wind. There are areas in Oaxaca, Mexico, where they have giant windmill farms that don't serve the people in those areas and are taking up their land and inhibiting their ability to use that land. So we're not trying to recreate that as we move to our new energy economy. And energy democracy means that we have more decentralization of energy production, and that more people have access to both benefiting from that energy in terms of economics, but also more say over how and where that energy goes. In the DC area, there is a group that is working with low-income communities to create solar cooperatives so that they reduce their energy bills and actually may at some point start to earn some income off of the energy that they produce. There is a school district in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where the high school created a program to teach students who are interested in how to design and maintain, or how to design, install, and maintain solar. And so they created a large solar array that's feeding into the grid, and not only are they learning a skill that will help them in the energy future, but they're also making so much money off of the energy that they produce that they're able to provide improvements and programs to other schools within that school district. So energy democracy is another important concept. And then finally, a just transition. What we see happening right now with the oil and gas industry is the example of what happens when we don't have a plan for how we're going to actually transition off of fossil and fuels and nuclear energy to a clean energy economy. And with the falling oil and gas prices, we're seeing many big oil and gas companies going bankrupt and or laying off workers. We need to make a plan so that as we're switching, workers have access to job training for the new energy economy, as well as income support as they're making that transition. So these are some of the things to think about in terms of vision. And then when it comes to strategy, we use a two-prong approach in our work, and we call it stop the machine, create a new world, or you can think about it as resisting harmful policies and creating alternative systems to replace the dysfunctional systems that we currently have. And so the systems that are currently being used are creating the outcomes that we have. So if we think, for instance, about something like our economic system or our capitalist economic system, we know that that is a system that has profit at its bottom line, and that, would think it's fine to extract things from the earth, to exploit the environment, exploit workers, as long as it was for profit, then that's fine within that system. There is now a kind of a new economy that's growing up around the world and in the U.S. Some call it a solidarity economy, or there's something called the Next System Project that's working on identifying what that new economy looks like. But it's really rooted more in cooperation, in solidarity, in sustainability, in creating an economy that does not drive wealth consolidation, but that creates a more equitable distribution. Some other systems that we would all recognize that we need to deal with would be things like racism and the systemic racism that's inherent in our policies in our country. So as we're creating these new systems, we need to be thinking about how they avoid replicating the systems that have caused exploitation and oppression in the past. It's also really important to, when we're looking at solutions, to be able to discern between false solutions and real solutions. There's, particularly if we look at the climate right now, and we look at kind of the industrial influence over the climate talks that the United Nations has been doing, there are a lot of industries that are looking to profit off of the climate crisis and not necessarily putting forward solutions that are good for people or the planet. And so we need to be really clear on understanding when a solution is one we should be supporting and when it is one that we should not. I think, for instance, here in the Baltimore area, our former governor, Martin O'Malley, was trying to give the impression of being an environmentalist. But one of the many things that he did was to try to push through the largest trash incinerator in the United States, putting that in a low-income community in Baltimore that has already been ravaged by a lot of industry and has poor health outcomes as a result. He called it a clean energy plant, and by doing that was able to avoid having to do environmental and health impact studies. Fortunately, that community fought back against that incinerator. It was started by a young high school student, young woman, and they were successful in fighting that back. And in so doing that, they also designed the solution that they wanted to see in its place. They designed a community solar farm that could be put on that land that would involve job training for people in that community and provide them with good quality jobs. So that was an example of a false solution, and that was replaced with a really great solution. Hopefully, they're still working on it. So once we have our strategy of resisting harmful policies and then putting in place new systems that create the kind of change that we want, we need to start thinking about what tactics we need to engage in to make that a reality. There's great research now that's available to us looking at the past 100 years of social movements and looking at what factors made them successful. And they found that nonviolent movements were twice as likely to be successful as violent movements. And in addition to that, nonviolent movements were more likely to create a positive form of change as well as a more lasting form of change. When they looked at nonviolent movements to see which ones of those were most successful, they were ones that moved from being a fringe movement to a mass movement. And that's done by thinking about the tactics that you use and making sure that you're using tactics that actually draw people into the movement. And also specifically thinking about who are the people that you want to draw into that movement? What is kind of the power structure that is holding up the system that you're trying to change, and how do you start to draw people from that power structure to your side, both increasing your power and diminishing theirs. When we talk about a mass movement, that sounds like, oh, I have to get everybody involved. It seems really daunting. But the reality is that what we need to do is move people towards a majority consensus for the change that we're talking about making. But in terms of actually activating people, organizing and mobilizing them, we only need to activate 3.5% of the population in order to be successful. Research shows that no government, whether it is a dictatorship or a democracy, has been able to withstand an activated base of 3.5% of the population. Another concept that I want to share with you that I learned during my work in the health reform process is an acronym that I call ICU. So think of it as we're facing crises and we need the ICU. And I stands for independent. It's really important that we as activists determine what the change is that we want to see, and not, look towards an institution like a political party or some other institution to tell us what that change is going to be. The next is C, which stands for clarity, and that means that we have to be clear about what it is that we want and also what we don't want. And so when we're offered solutions, we need to be able to understand clearly whether they move us in the right direction or they don't. The third the U stands for uncompromising. And so often in our work, we're told that we have to be pragmatic, that, politics is all about compromise. And on certain things, we just can't compromise. There's a saying from Gandhi that we can't compromise on fundamentals because it's all give and no take. And so often I see that telling people that they have to be pragmatic is a way of taking their power away and making them accept less than they need. I wanted to just close with a few thoughts about activism as a health professional, because when I first started practicing medicine, this certainly wasn't the vision that I had for myself. And I think that being a medical professional, a health professional, really informs the way that I approach activism. For one thing, I'm not interested in treating the symptoms alone without understanding what the underlying disease is and what we need to do to get at the roots of that underlying disease. So getting at the systems, systemic level, and working for change there, which will, if we do that, will have a much broader and lasting impact than if we just try to deal with the symptoms. In addition to that is looking at tactics that are effective. It's really important that we take the time to analyze the situation and figure out what tactics are going to be the most effective, and be willing to be flexible and change tactics if we see that they're not working or that the circumstances have changed in any way. My path as an activist has led me into places that I've had, where I've had to step outside of my comfort zone and stand up, sometimes speak out. That can be a little scary. You're not sure how you're going to be received. Sometimes I risk arrest, and sometimes I am actually arrested. And when the first time that I went into that kind of a situation, and myself and two other physicians and some other activists did an action in a committee, we had the conversation beforehand about kind of our concerns around whether taking this sort of action might cause repercussions. for our medical licenses. And the more that we thought about it, the clearer it became that if the medical licensing board wanted to, give us some difficulties over the fact that we were standing up so that everybody could have access to health care, then that would be a good discussion to have with the medical board, because in truth, why are we being complicit with a system that is leaving tens of millions of people out and causing preventable deaths and unnecessary suffering? Why aren't more health professionals actually standing up and speaking out against the system that we're in? So standing up and speaking out is both really empowering. It feels great to speak truth to power when you're on the side of truth and justice, and that it often gives other people around you, the permission to do the same thing. Many people are looking for someone to take that first step, and so you may find quickly when you stand up and speak out that you're not alone. Finally, I just wanted to congratulate you at University of California for having a bold vision of moving towards carbon neutral buildings and transportation by 2025. I think that more of us need to be pushing for a much faster agenda for this transition. But I also urge you, if you haven't started doing this already, to move beyond kind of the campus in the work that you're doing to push for the clean energy future. Because particularly, when I look at the city of San Francisco, you have high levels of wealth inequality, gentrification that's happening, people that are being pushed out of the city. And so we don't want these changes that we're working towards. This comes back again to the human rights principles of universality and equity. We don't want these changes to just be in privileged areas. In fact, I think it's really important for us in our work to be focusing on the people who are the most vulnerable, the communities that have faced the most disinvestment or neglect, and really lift those communities up first by working with them, supporting them, and letting them take the lead. But we need to reach out beyond our own comfort zone, our own kind of borders, and support communities around us so that all of us can move forward together. And then I guess lastly, just part of the reason that I became an activist as a physician, and other physicians that I've talked to who become activists have faced similar kind of situations, is that the patients that come into our offices, much of the reason for why they're there is related to the environment that they live in. And so if you think about, a child who comes into your office with asthma, we can treat them with medication, but if we're sending them back out and they live in a community that has an oil refinery less than a mile away, then we're not really doing a service to just continue to kind of medicate their symptoms. We need to get out in that community and work with them to get rid of that oil refinery and move to a healthier source of energy in their community. So I hope that this information has been helpful to you. I could talk for hours about this, so I just tried to give you a quick kind of taste of how we do the work that we're doing. I urge you to check out our website, popularresistance.org. And if you have any questions, do get in touch with me. I'm happy to answer them. And my email is info@popularresistance.org. So I hope that you have a great conference. Happy Earth Day, and thanks for inviting me.